My husband discovered my affair after finding video evidence, which destroyed my life in front of our family and children. I had hoped to arrive early at the lawyer's office, but when my lawyer and I arrived, Dave and his lawyer were already in the conference room. Seeing him with an attractive woman triggered my usual jealous response, making me feel inferior to him. At 48, he was even more handsome than he had been at 20. Tall, muscular, successful in business, and leading the local chamber of commerce. The thought that if things didn't go well today, I might never again feel his comforting arms around me filled me with dread. Dave barely acknowledged me as I entered the room with my lawyer. My face turned pale when the red-haired lawyer reached out to comfort him. I interpreted her gesture as her eagerness to finish the meeting quickly so she could pursue him. I knew from experience that she would find him irresistible, as my husband was skilled at using his charm. Dave smiled faintly at her, but kept his expression neutral when he glanced at me. His refusal to speak to me frustrated me, forcing me to sit silently as my lawyer spoke with the red-haired lawyer. I watched as Dave pulled a folder from my oversized purse, opened it, and laid out a 2-page document. Seeing his faint smile, I realized he knew I had prepared thoroughly for this meeting. He set up a laptop, connected the speakers, and placed a single sheet of paper beside it. Casually, he rested his hands on the table and looked at me with a polite but detached expression. No anger, no hatred, no sadness. I had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, memorizing my script, hoping to appeal to his emotions. We were gathered to discuss Mrs. Julianne Brown's decision to sign the divorce petition, if Dave would listen to her for at least an hour. "If everyone is ready, I suggest we begin," she said, turning the timer dial. The loud ticking filled the silence in the room. I was frustrated that Dave insisted on having lawyers present rather than meeting privately. I had planned to share my feelings for the next 45 minutes, hoping to make Dave admit to something that would justify my actions. It was awkward with strangers present, but I had no choice. Glancing at my unnecessary notes, I crossed my fingers and remembered Sonia's advice. Taking a deep breath, I thanked Dave for agreeing to meet with me, admitted my mistake, and clarified that it wasn't because of his shortcomings, but rather due to my own selfishness. I had spent days reflecting on this, hoping that Dave would appreciate my honesty. I believed he wanted to forgive me, and my speech was meant to give him the justification he needed. As I thought about how the kids might react, I considered using the "you can't break up the family" argument, confident that it would work. Watching his reaction, I was surprised by his response. In the silence that followed, Dave's face remained unchanged. He didn't even look at me. Calmly, he raised his pen and ticked off the first sentence in his notes. His response shook my confidence, and I realized that not only had I spent 30 years knowing him, but he had spent the same amount of time studying me. I wasn't ashamed to admit that I was shocked. I emphasized the importance of sticking to the script, reiterating that my situation with him was the result of my own foolish and selfish choices. I explained how I had felt lost, unattractive, and worthless. I told him about meeting Jason while working on a church committee, describing him as sophisticated and a skilled seducer who knew exactly when and how to act like a friend. After church meetings last year, when Dave was often away, Jason began listening to my problems and suggested we grab coffee one day. I naively agreed, thinking it was harmless. He seemed like a good friend, and I didn't realize he was skilled at breaking through a woman's defenses. From coffee shops, we moved to restaurants where he confided about his marriage. The restaurants grew more upscale, and the gifts he gave me became more extravagant. "Oh, Dave, you can't imagine how flattering it is when a guy 15 years younger than you tries to win you over," I said. "But you'd be proud because 4 months ago, he asked me to sleep with him and I turned him down." I should have stopped meeting him after that, but by then, I had grown dependent on the boost his attention gave me. I fell silent, wiping away tears with my finger, which I had rubbed on an onion in my pocket to make my eyes water. I paused, then started again, my voice faltering. I'm so ashamed that I didn't break up with him. He took me to a restaurant and bought a $1,300 bottle of Grange, even though he doesn't drink wine. I drank almost all of it. I was too nervous to resist him. When we left the restaurant, he offered to take me home, and I foolishly agreed. Once in the driveway, he kissed me, and I was too drunk to stop him. You know how I get after a couple of glasses of wine. Then he started touching me. At that point, my judgment was gone, and all I could think was to get him out of the driveway before the neighbors saw. I opened the garage door and had him park inside. The next morning, Jason got out of the car as the garage door was closing and kissed me again. I knew what he wanted, but I was too far gone. I admitted that even though I knew what I was doing, I couldn't stop. He took my key and guided me inside. I led him to one of the spare bedrooms, and I'll carry the shame of what happened that day until the day I die. I allowed him to do whatever he wanted with me. I'm deeply sorry, Dave. My only redemption was that I was calm enough to make him use protection before anything happened. After Jason left, I think we both fell asleep. Me because I was drunk, and him because he must have been exhausted after a long pursuit. I know for sure that I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been drunk and feeling low. If I had been sober, I would have kicked him out immediately. Instead, you entered the room and turned on the light. I've never been more embarrassed in my life. The pain on your face broke me. It hit me how much harm I had caused to you and to us with one reckless mistake. Tears streamed from one eye as I looked pleadingly at my husband. After spending a lifetime together, I thought I could read his expressions like an open book, but in that moment, I was wrong. His face stayed neutral. In fact, he didn't even look at me. He was fiddling with the laptop in front of him. I assumed he was writing something until he clicked on a link, and suddenly my voice came through the speakers. "Don't kiss me, you beer breath. What about you, rotten great breath?" I had one rotten great breath, I heard myself say. The audio clip cut off abruptly, and the room fell into a deafening silence. Or maybe it wasn't silence. The roaring in my head drowned out everything else. Yes, I was mortified when Dave walked in on me with Jason that night, grabbing him by the hair and beating him. But that didn't even compare to the shock of being caught in a huge lie. It knocked me completely off balance. I was so sure my script would work. My eyes frantically scanned the room. Dave's lawyer gave a slight smile. Mine looked uncomfortable. And Dave just stared at me with that same emotionless expression. Later, I'll never understand why I didn't realize what it all meant. Why didn't it occur to me that Dave had an audio recording of my meeting with Jason that night? It never crossed my mind to think logically about why he would have a recorder. Why would he need one unless he already knew he would catch something on it? What else did we say? The silence in the room stretched on, and I glanced at the scattered notes I had prepared, feeling stupid for diving into the script after everything that had just happened. I clung to it like a drowning person clings to debris. It was only once. It won't happen again. Nothing like that again. Please, believe me. I just wasn't strong enough to resist him, but I wasn't so out of control that I would have let him take me in our own bed. I would never have done that, no matter how drunk I was. We were in Megan's old room, right? Dave just looked at me with sadness in his eyes, and I couldn't tell which was worse, the sorrow on his face or his total indifference. He shook his head and turned his attention back to the computer. I could feel, if not hear, him double-clicking the icon. I cringed. Then, Jason's voice came through the speakers. "I just like to watch how you lie in front of me, full of desire." "It's so hot," Jason said, and after the clip ended, Dave clicked again. Jason's voice followed. "When can we have time in bed again? In your clueless husband's bed." It was so cool. This time, Dave clicked to end the recording and looked at me silently, accusingly. What could I say? All of my excuses had been shattered. Not by Dave, but by my own words. A one-time drunken mistake? Protecting myself? Not getting close with my husband in our own bed? In just 30 words, everything I had said was exposed as a lie. I stood there, speechless, uncomfortable. I looked at Dave, hoping for some hint of what he was thinking, but his neutral gaze gave nothing away. I noticed my lawyer checking her watch, reminding me that the 60 minutes I had to save my marriage were slipping away, and I realized how badly things were going. Panic set in, but I forced myself to push it down. "I'm sorry for lying, Dave, about it being the first time. I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. I thought if I could convince you it was a one-time thing, you wouldn't be so angry," I said, stammering. I fell silent again. Should I admit that I had been meeting Jason several times a week for over 6 months? The problem was, I didn't know what Dave knew. He had recorded our conversations, so the night he caught us wasn't the first time, but how many times had there been? What else did he know? The fact that the recorder had been hidden where I usually met Jason made me suspect that Dave knew about at least one more time. But I wasn't sure. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I was caught telling one more lie, it would all be over. Well, Juliana, it's time to be vague, avoid details, and stick to the facts, I thought. The truth was, Jason did seduce me, and it didn't happen overnight. He liked older women, and I admit it did boost my ego to be pursued by a man almost my kid's age. I was weak. I considered saying that I had only used the master bedroom once, the first time, but that would be a lie that might make me look better. I held back, unsure how much Dave already knew. I couldn't take the risk of lying again. With limited time to fix things, I focused on my notes. I discarded my initial points and focused on the words I had highlighted in capital letters. I told Dave that I never stopped loving and respecting him. I emphasized that I had given him no less love than I always had. I explained that Jason was just an additional dimension in my life that didn't take away from my love for Dave, but instead added to it in some strange way. When I finished speaking, Dave looked at his laptop again, furrowed his brow, and seemed momentarily confused. He eventually relaxed and started listening to the recording again. I understood that his frown meant he was searching for something on the screen, but eventually he realized it was one of the open files. It would be better if he didn't understand, and he started over, going back to the start of the video. I revisited Jason's comment about being close in our marital bed. Like the first time, I cringed. I had already told him never again, not after that night. I remember Dave stepping out of the shower and inadvertently stepping on a large drop of white wine, for which I was grateful. Dave accepted my explanation about sneezing, attributing the drop to mucus sinking down into my seat. I anticipated the predictable response that would follow, though at first I felt a sense of pride when I spoke those words. However, that feeling quickly faded. I distracted Dave by offering to clean his leg and did so in a pleasant manner, shifting his focus. "You have to admit, babe, sometimes your husband acts like an ignorant fool," I remarked. As I spoke, I found myself talking about how Jason and I had skillfully avoided being caught, such as the time he had to hide in the closet when Dave came home unexpectedly. Yes, Dave is clueless. Initially, I found it endearing that he trusted me so much, but now I just see him as a fool. Sometimes, I wonder if we could have sex right here while he's in the room. That mocking tone made me realize I was emphasizing an actual point with my words, and in doing so, I couldn't even convince myself that I loved and respected my husband, let alone him. Confusion began to set in. Before this meeting, I convinced myself that I loved and respected Dave, but after what I had done and said, how could that still be true? The tense silence grew thicker after the final blow to my defense, and Dave turned to face me. I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes, so I turned to his lawyer instead. The contempt on her face made me stop entertaining any thoughts that Dave was just another client to her. It was clear. I shifted my gaze away from her and looked at my lawyer, who, though she tried to hide it, wasn't quick enough to conceal her disdain. Here I was, fighting for my future, surrounded by people who clearly thought of me as something they had stepped into at the dog park, and one of them should have been on my side. My confidence melted away like morning dew under the hot sun, and my self-esteem followed suit. Maybe that's why I turned to my notes, choosing to take a more offensive approach. I told Dave that over the last 6 months, he had been paying less attention to me, taking me for granted, traveling more for work, and seemingly growing distant. All of this happened around the same time the children left home, leaving me feeling lost and unimportant. I told him how he was never there when I needed him, never reassuring me about my age or attractiveness or providing the comfort I longed for. As I paused, I saw Dave's eyes flicking back to his screen. I winced as his fingers moved to open the selected file. It became clear that Jason's words were from shortly after our second encounter that night, just before Dave reached his breaking point. Jason spoke about our declining sex life, expressing a desire for more frequent encounters. He mentioned a canceled trip and how I had asked him to restrict Dave's diet. Jason explained that he only had the chance that night because Dave had an urgent meeting. He even expressed a wish for Dave to travel more often. "I want more," Jason responded irritably, before the clip was cut off again. Ashamed, I lowered my gaze to the table, avoiding 3 judgmental stares. I recalled my emotional state during that last conversation. The truth was, the excitement of having a lover, even one as young and energetic as Jason, was starting to wear off. Jason and I had betrayed my husband, and it had caused me to lose respect for Dave. It was that loss of respect, more than anything else, that had begun to distance me emotionally from him. As I prepared for this meeting, fully intending to blame him for pulling away from me, I realized that it was a lie. I had allowed myself to continue betraying him, and in doing so, I had emotionally distanced myself from him. Cutting him off in bed had been an easy decision, simply because Dave's approach to lovemaking was so different from Jason's. The impatience that Jason had made it impossible to confuse the two. This only confirmed to me that what I was doing was incredibly wrong. So, I began rejecting my husband's advances. At first, he pushed back, but then he stopped. Suddenly, it clicked. This should have been glaringly obvious to me months ago. Dave had given up on our sex life around the same time he started working longer hours and traveling more often. At the time, I thought he was emotionally distancing himself from me. I closed my eyes, now completely confused about who was pulling away from whom. And then, it hit me. Dave must have known for a long time. That's why he had hidden the recorder in Megan's room. Damn. My whole approach to this meeting had been to downplay my actions, repair Dave's wounded pride, and salvage the future I so desperately wanted. I thought I was soothing a recently injured bull, but if I was right, and he had known at least 2 weeks before confronting me, then he was far more clever than I had given him credit for. I had wasted my time trying to appeal to his emotions. In short, I had no idea what to do. I am much better when I plan things than when I'm spontaneous, hence my 2 pages of notes, but time was running out. The ticking of the clock only confirmed this. Desperate, I picked up my notes and began searching for hope. The pounding in my head made it hard to focus, and nothing jumped out at me. Then I realized the recordings were a red herring. The game had shifted entirely. If Dave knew I was leaving for a while, what was his state of mind? Of course, he was hurt by my betrayal, but more than that, he was concerned about my motives. Was I unsatisfied with the quantity or quality of our lovemaking? Did I find him boring and want to explore my kinky side? Did I love Jason? Was I planning to run away with him? I could correct these fears. I risked looking into those emotionless eyes, wondering if I should lie again. If only I could remember what else Jason and I talked about that night. If only I could be certain that this was the only night Dave had recorded. The sequence had to be suspect. He couldn't have known for long. He wasn't a great actor. I desperately wanted to convince him that I still loved and respected him. The fact that I feared losing him proved it, far beyond the fear of losing my comfortable lifestyle. But how could I convince him that I respected him after we had all heard me call him a fool in front of my lover? What was the point of trying to justify insulting him to my lover, as if it would ease my conscience and strengthen a bond between Jason and me? There was no point. The same went for love. If I had caught him betraying me, nothing could have made me believe he still loved me. So convincing him that I loved and respected him would take time. I had bought time by convincing him not to force me to sign the divorce papers immediately, but how long would that damn timer keep ticking? One thing was certain, my next few sentences had to make an impact. Summoning my courage, I turned my gaze across the table to Dave. I told him that I understood he felt I had lost my love and respect, assuring him that it wasn't true. I reaffirmed my love for him and our life together, expressing a genuine wish to spend the rest of my days only with him. I admitted the seriousness of my actions, acknowledging that Jason had been a distraction and that I didn't love him. I also reassured Dave that running away with Jason had never been my plan. I confessed my wrongdoing, especially in response to Jason's suggestion to limit our closeness, reflecting on the situation. I admitted I didn't know why I went through with it, especially after convincing myself that I was simply giving Jason something Dave couldn't provide. I pointed out that Jason didn't have the stamina or experience that Dave did, and my actions had been driven entirely by lust and selfishness. While the physical aspect offered brief satisfaction, it was devoid of any real emotion. I clarified that I didn't engage in the same perversions with Jason that I'd denied Dave over the years. Time seemed to drag, as if mirroring the pace of those on the verge of passing away. The collapse of my marriage unfolded slowly, while everyone around me moved at a normal pace. To my left, my lawyer showed her disgust. Tossing her pen on the table and turning to me, it was clear that, in that moment, I couldn't even find someone who would support me. Dave's lawyer leaned over to get a better look at the laptop screen, and it became evident that Dave wasn't playing audio files, as I had assumed, but rather video clips. This realization made the situation even more severe. Dave's lawyer grasped his hand in a gesture of solidarity. Though Dave wasn't looking at me, his reaction conveyed deep hurt, as if the person he trusted most had betrayed him. I caught a fleeting expression of devastation on his face, and a single tear slid down the cheek closest to me. I wondered whether he was truly suffering, or if he had steeled himself by focusing on the screen. Amid the chaos, a few trivial facts registered in my mind. The recording had been made at least 3 weeks before the incident, meaning Dave had been aware of my betrayal for some time, enough to recognize a pattern. Silence enveloped us as the speakers played. The warmth that had once filled the room turned into a feeling of filthiness, sloppiness, and vulgarity. I stared at the table while my lawyer laid the divorce papers in front of me. Helpless, I couldn't counter the shocking evidence Dave had uncovered with ease. He dismantled all of my rationalizations, justifications, and weak attempts at reconciliation. It was over. Dave, like a conductor, didn't speak a word. Instead, he silently guided the proceedings, directing the next part of this symphony of separation. No, it wasn't Dave. I ascended the scaffold myself, blindfolded and with a noose in hand, kicking the lever. Dave merely built the scaffold and walked away. Once he played the final clip, he knew exactly what I would say. He left me with no chance of redemption. When I finally came up with arguments based on my intimate knowledge of him, gained from observing him for 3 decades, I forgot that he, too, had been watching me with the same sharp, penetrating eyes. The shame and humiliation were overwhelming, and they finally drove me to flee. What I needed now was escape, back to the house that was still mine, at least until Dave received the eviction notice, as per the agreement. I sought refuge with the children, hoping they would never learn the truth and would continue to love me unconditionally. The only route to salvation seemed to be through accepting the loss of most of my life. I took the pen, signed the 2 agreements, and tossed it away in one smooth motion. I was surprised that Dave's business wasn't worth more, but that was what my lawyer's assessment concluded. Of course, by that time, Dave had probably hidden most of it. Fortunately, the last recording had ended, and the heavy silence returned. My lawyer took the signed papers, handed me a copy, and placed the rest in her briefcase. She left the room, leaving me frozen and torn between the urge to run and the desire to convey some kind of positive message. I longed for a spark of hope, something to convince myself that there might be a chance to reignite the flame someday and let Dave know I still cared about his well-being. The sharp sound of an alarm clock broke my thoughts, prompting me to rise and speak my final words. The woman holding Dave's hand, pleading with him not to seek revenge on Jason, expressed her fear of never forgiving herself if Jason ended up in prison. Dave's response was another damning video. Thankfully, it didn't feature my voice but that of another woman speaking in an almost shrill tone. She warned of the consequences Jason would face if her brothers got to him first, identifying herself as Mrs. Jason. Initially, I had thought that Jason's silence after the beating reflected his fear, but now I wondered if being divorced and penniless might be a fitting end for the scammer. The weight of my conscience grew heavier as I considered that he might die because of his involvement with me. As I prepared to leave, I couldn't bring myself to look Dave in the eyes. Whether he wore an expressionless face or whether he was laughing or crying, it all caused me pain, a constant reminder of how I had mistreated this good man. He had lost everything except for my house and money, and had suffered a deep emotional wound, all at my hands. I deserved every bit of his anger. Through tears, I managed to mutter a weak goodbye as I shuffled toward the door. My pitiful attempt to salvage my old life was discarded like a plague beetle. Perhaps my daughter Megan would visit me while I sank into oblivion, or if she wasn't available, maybe my son Joel. Just as I began to push the door open, voices from behind me caught my attention. Another recording. An excited young male voice accused, cheater. A very familiar female voice intervened, asking, "Are you sure, Dad?" "I think I'll drink alone today," was Dave's quiet reply,